bar in Barcelona that serves vegan food. And they serve their burgers in multiple colors, and it's really funky, and it's very street art vibe, and too hipster for my husband, but it's very much my vibe. And as you walk in, it says, "Thank you for saving the planet." Now, I consider myself someone who is conscious of my behavior and the environmental impact of my behavior. And so when I saw this sign, I was like, yeah, kind of saving the planet. I'm not a vegetarian, by the way, but the food was delicious. And as we sat down, the food came in paper plates. And I ordered a cocktail, and I got not one paper straw, but 2 paper straws. And this irritated me, because it's not really saving the planet, right? Like, it comes down to this discussion of, plastic versus paper. Yes, the EU regulations came in and said, no single-use plastic. So what did we do? We went for single-use paper, and I think we know that paper that gets touched by food also doesn't get recycled. It goes straight into landfill. And so it got me thinking that it's not about one material over the other. It's about practicing sustainable habits. And I got thinking about it, because at the end of the day, yes, it's great that this restaurant is going for vegan food, and it's targeting the meat industry and trying to lower the emissions in the meat industry, which, by the way, produces 5.8% of global emissions. But at the same time, by bringing the food in with paper, which, like I said, it ends up in landfill, it still has to decompose. It still produces carbon emissions whilst it's decomposing. Yes, it's not plastic, but it still has to decompose. They are actually increasing their waste and goes into landfill, so they're contributing, whilst reducing in the meat industry, they're contributing to a different industry, and that is the waste industry, which makes up of 3.2% of global emissions. And so my point here, and what I see very often, is that we have clients, and I know a lot of people, who are specifically targeting one industry, but at the same time, they are neglecting a different industry, and I'll get into that. Hi, I'm Claire. I'm a senior web performance consultant for Cognizant Netcentric. The title does not necessarily reflect what I do. But today, I want to talk about one big industry that very often gets neglected, gets forgotten, and that is the internet. So for the longest period of time, I myself thought that digital was green. I would ask, do you think digital is green? Not really, not sure. Well, it's not. And the reason for this is because the internet runs on one big resource, and that is electricity. And the issue here is that electricity at the moment, generally globally, 60% of that is actually created by burning fossil fuels. Now, to give you a bit of perspective, the tech industry produces 3.7% of global emissions. Yeah, it's not that much. But again, perspective, the aviation industry is 1.9. So it's more than the aviation industry. And it's growing, right? It's growing rapidly, especially now we have artificial intelligence, and the amount of carbon emissions that is going to be creating is next level, and at speeds of next level. So it's growing. And why is this? I mean, we can break up the tech industry into 2 sections. On one side, we have the hardware, so production of hardware, and that is embodied carbon. But today I want to talk about the other side of it, and that's software. And we're talking about, devices, and that is consuming software. We're talking about data centers, and data centers get a really bad rap, and obviously also networking as well. So as I work in websites, I want to break it down for you in websites. So according to HTTP Archives, a standard web page, single page, weighs 2.2 megabytes. Now, the average page view of this page is about 1,000. Yes, we have clients, for example, who have 90 million views a year, and then you obviously have other websites that have very few. I mean, probably my own portfolio website has like 1 or 2 views. So we're averaging it out to 1,000 for now. That over a year creates 264 gigabytes of data. Now, we're in the era of petabytes, so gigabytes, that's not a big deal. But if you come from the era of floppy disks, can you imagine how many floppy disks that is? It's ridiculous thousands. Like, it's beyond, I don't know, I mean, I got lost. So I calculated, and there are many tools out there, and I will get into that, how to calculate, etc. But I calculated that that actually produces 9.5 kilograms of carbon emissions per year. Now, in the grand scheme of things, it's not really that much when we're talking about taking an airplane somewhere and the amount of carbon emissions you have by just, flying from one city to the next, right? It's not that big. It's not tangible. But let me make it tangible for you. That's the same amount as if you were to take a car from 2020 and drove from Utrecht to Eindhoven. That's how much a car produces, and that's how much one single web page produces in a year. So, okay, maybe it's not that much either. It's just one trip. We're talking about a year when it comes to the web page. We're talking about one trip here with the car, right? It's not that much. But when we start talking about every single web page that is indexed on the internet, we're now into the billions of web pages. This is from Citify. I don't know how true this is, but we all know that there are huge amounts of pages on the internet, right? So for now, it's 30 billion. In the past, you can see it goes up and down. There has been stages where it's been 60 billion, but right now, let's talk about 30 billion. Now, I've been generous, and I've broken it down into 500 page views. Again, you have companies that have way more, and you have sites that have way less. And we're talking about pages here, right? I calculated that that is 141.7 million metric tons of carbon emissions. That would take 10 million cars, also from 2020. So I also looked it up. There are about 10 million cars in the Netherlands, so almost every single car in the Netherlands, if you assumed they were all from 2020, to drive around the Earth 3 times. Do I have your attention? It's a lot. And the issue is that most of the time we don't see that it's tangible. It's not tangible. It's sitting in a data center somewhere. We don't have laptops that have emissions coming straight out them like we see with cars. The biggest issue that we face often in working in websites is data. Yes, I also mentioned data centers. I think they get a bad rap. The problem is, have you ever asked yourself why we need so many data centers? Because we are creating the data. And the biggest problems that we have are product bloat and carbon-heavy products. So on one side, we are creating stupid amounts of information, stupid amounts of features and content and blog posts and videos and so much stuff that very often doesn't even get consumed. I mean, I read somewhere by Forbes the other day that about 85% of all websites are not even active. Like, that's a little shocking, I think. And then on the other side, we have carbon-heavy products. So the irony of this is that obviously the internet has become way more efficient. I think we can all agree, way more efficient since the time of dial-up. And on the other hand, we're also building websites and products that are becoming way less efficient. We're like, OK, we have the power. Let's just throw stuff at it and just make really heavy sites and pages and products because the internet can run it now. We often see that many websites have really bad web performance because of this. Pages take ages to load because we're loading so much stuff on them. So generally, the discussion is, the rule of thumb is if you put less data on, for example, your website, That's less space it takes up in a data center, uses less electricity, which in turn means less pollution. And then, of course, on the flip side, which is great, you have more efficient and lighter websites and products. It's great. And then if you dump it on a green host, all your problems are solved. I take issue with this, because just because you're putting it on a green host, we're still producing all this data, and it gets more complicated than that. But for now, I want to talk about how I looked at 100 websites, and I did it in my free time, and yes, I had fun doing it. I targeted climate action businesses. So this comes back down to industry, right? I targeted businesses that either build, sell services, products to solve the climate crisis. And I looked at their websites, and I found that the average page weight is 7 megabytes. So that's already 300% more than your average page. The largest one that I found was 36 megabytes. And remember, I'm not talking about websites here. I am talking about a single page, the home page. The good news is that I found that 64% of these businesses already are green hosting. And this is where I take issue, because 34% of those 64 have pages that are larger than 7 megabytes. What tells me is that a lot of these businesses are already green hosting, but they probably don't know that they are. Most of them have gone with some of the hyperscalers, AWS being one of them, who are already trying to use renewable energy. But the issue that I see here is that by going green hosting, you haven't solved the problem, because many people don't know that they're green hosting. They're still producing massive pages and websites and massive products. And just to point out, this page here, that's 36 megabytes, they were green hosting. So just to break it down for you, this page that was green hosted, 36 megabytes, produces more carbon emissions than one of the sites that I found that was not green hosted, but had 0.9 megabytes. So it had way less carbon emissions. And remember, this is one site, and this is per page view. So obviously, it's very complicated, because then you start going into the carbon intensity of the grid. So you have, carbon emissions of your data center are reduced because they're going for green energy, but it really depends on where they're doing it. A lot of hyperscalers have their data centers in Ireland, for example, and Ireland has one of the dirtier grids in Europe, Germany as well, unfortunately. That is where I'm from. And Poland here is next level. The Netherlands, I took the liberty of looking at, and they're kind of in between. Some of the biggest challenges that we're facing at the moment, particularly in green coding, green software, is a lot of discussion. How do we even measure? How do we even do this? And so there are not standards yet. I myself am part of the W3C working group. I'm trying to define standards mainly for product management and business. My colleague is on the web dev group. And there's just a lot of discussion, like what is the best way to measure, et cetera, et cetera. So the problem is that's also really hard to measure, because there's so much involved, right? We have data center, data transfer over the wire. We have energy intensity of web data. We have carbon intensity of electricity, data center, energy sources, and then we have the web traffic as well. So there's a lot of things that go into them, and it's just very, very hard to measure. There are tools out there that help you to measure. So that's what I want to do. I want to start with you with measuring the status quo. So I'm going to ask you to get your phones out and open up this QR code. Take your website, your business's website, your own website, and put it into the website carbon calculator. For me, this is like the first place you start. It's like, if you're a beginner in this field, this is where you start. I'm not going to ask you for your results right now, because you're all going to hit one data center, one server at the moment, so it might take a while. But I'm going to come back to your results, because I want to know. Here's a list of tools that you can use, and I urge you to take a photograph of this as well, to use to measure the status quo of your websites. Most of them apply only to websites, but some of them actually apply also to just general products and coding. And I urge you to take that with you to your business, to your marketing teams, because very often it's marketing who's creating big amounts of content. Take it to them and get them to test your business's website. I took the liberty of looking at the TEQnation website with these tools, and I found that A, they are not green hosting, and B, their homepage is 7.5 megabytes large. So again, about 300% larger than your average web page. And again, this is just the home page. Now, I calculated that it probably makes sense to use about 200 views a month. I mean, this is a conference for 700 people. Probably most of the year, the page is not active. And I calculated that that's about 6.5 kilograms of carbon emissions per year for this single page. Now, let me make that a bit more tangible for you as well. It's the same carbon emissions you would be producing if you drove from Utrecht Central to The Hague train station. It's really not a huge amount if we're considering global emissions, right? But at the end of the day, we're also, again, talking about one web page in 1 year. So what do we do with this measurement? We start to optimize. And I want to talk about 3 things today. There are so many things that we could talk about. We could go way more technical. I think that's space for a different talk. There's so many things that we can begin to optimize, but one of the things I want to talk about is content, especially because as developers, very often, you guys don't get to decide necessarily what the content is. But I want to give you an argument to take to the people, to the business people, to say, we don't want heavy content. I want to give you the argument that if you have really heavy content, loads of videos, carousels with videos autoplayed, believe me, we've seen that. 5 videos in a carousel, autoplayed. Tell them to reduce the content because it matters, because the content that they're putting on their pages is actually creating carbon emissions. And bring it to them and calculate it with the tools that I've given you and make it tangible. And they're going to want to know, because whether they like it or not, CSRD is coming in next year for a lot of businesses, so Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So sustainability reporting is going to be a really, really, really big thing for many businesses next year, and even more businesses the year after. And give the content an expiry date. Like I said, there are so many blog posts and videos and vlogs and all these things, and very often they are just not viewed or touched, and it's still sitting there. All it's doing is sitting there in a data center, taking up space, creating carbon emissions. And then make it actionable. I know that, it depends on the business. If you're social media, you kind of want people to sit there all day long scrolling, and that's also causing carbon emissions. But try and be really purposeful and make it actionable. Allow your users to get from A to B as fast as possible. And it's a good user experience, but at the same time, you're also reducing the amount of time spent loading the content. And then you have the design side of things. So I think we all know that assets are very often some of the heavier pieces of content that are sitting on the web. Optimize them. We have the power. These are small things. These are actionable things that we can do. We can optimize them. We can get the right formatting. We can lazy load them, because we should only be loading the content that's being consumed. Because if you make your user also consume the content that they're not consuming, you're sucking up their data as well, and that's annoying for me as well. If I have to lose my battery, it runs out because I'm loading so much stuff that I don't want. And then we have the custom fonts. So again, I think this is something that you can bring to your designers and say, it doesn't really make sense to have custom fonts, right? It's bad for your web performance. It means that loading time is longer. It means that you're also, producing more carbon emissions whilst you're doing it. And do you really need it? Yes, I know there are brands that really need it. But if you're a new brand starting out, do you really need it? Especially on your website. I mean, you have a logo. Does it matter if you're using Arial or something funky that your designers made? I mean, usually the designers made it to look a little bit different and cool, right? But does it really enhance the user experience? And then we have dark mode. So obviously, every screen is made up of lots of little lights. And if you have a whiter screen, it needs a lot more power to light it up than a darker screen. Which is why I've gone for this kind of color coding in my presentation. But these are really simple, small things that you can do right now or today or tomorrow and take them to your designers, your marketers, and anyone who's creating that content. And dark mode, hey, it's also kind of trendy at the moment. It's kind of on the rise, right? And then we have the development side of things. Now, forgive me, I am not actually a techie, so I think there are much bigger conversations around this that can be had that go in much more detail. And if you are interested in having that conversation, I have a colleague who's super into this, and she is a techie. But the point is, like I mentioned, the internet is getting more and more efficient. So keep up with your tech stacks. Make sure that you're throwing out all the legacy code, the legacy platforms, all that kind of stuff, and make sure that you're up to date and you're running efficiently. And then you also have all the unused scripts. So very often we find that there's a lot of unused CSS because of different kind of frameworks that have been used, Bootstrap or whatever. They use them, and then there's a lot of code that's in there that's not actually being used. It's just kind of sitting there. And then there's, JavaScript. Reduce that if you can. There's a lot of things that don't have to be solved in JavaScript, but we see very often it is solved in JavaScript because someone kind of felt like they wanted to do something. And I get it. I totally get it. People want to learn. They want to learn a new language or something, and then they try and experiment, and then they put it in there. I get it. But at the same time, this also increases the loading time, and loading time also increases carbon emissions. And then let's try and avoid technical debt. So let's try and avoid building things that aren't used or aren't properly replaceable or aren't easily updatable. This is also something you can bring to the UX designers. It's so important that UX designers do their work well because they should have tested things properly before you build them. Because if you build something that isn't ever used, it's still time and effort from your side, which is another story of how many carbon emissions that is. But on the other side, you've then built something that's sitting in your product or your website that then nobody is using, and then obviously it's data that is sitting there doing nothing other than producing carbon emissions. And then I want to talk about shifting responsibility. So can I get a show of hands here of anyone here in the crowd who considers themselves environmentally conscious? OK, that's a good amount of people. How many of you are environmentally conscious at home, but then leave it at the door when you go to work? No one? OK, let me rephrase the question. How many of you are environmentally conscious at home, but then when you go to work, you don't know how you can apply that to your everyday at work? OK, so there's a bit more people. There's a few more. OK. Society tells us that it's our responsibility as single people to reduce our carbon emissions. Society tells us that when you leave the room, you should switch the light off. Society tells us that when we brush our teeth, we should switch the water off. Society tells us that we should fly less. There are so many mandates to the individual person, what we should be doing in order to reduce our carbon emissions. Society has made it our individual responsibility. I don't agree with that. I think very often we can also say, hey, it's the big corporates, right? It's the big corporates that are producing mass amounts of carbon emissions and they're not really tackling the issue. It's the big corporates who are, the big marketing machine. They're telling me I need to consume this stuff. They're saying, hey, you should consume my toothpaste. And then when you consume it, they're like, oh, but you didn't choose the green option. So big corporates are throwing the responsibility at individuals when it's also their responsibility. But I don't agree with that argument either. Because it is us, as individuals, who go to work every day and we run these businesses. We are the people making those decisions. We are the people running a business. We are the people who are saying, hey, you should consume X. We are the people who are saying, I have this website with all this really cool information that I want you to be here for a long time and consume it. We're the ones who are doing that. We are part of that problem. Which is why I'm asking, do you take your sustainability and your consciousness to work with you? Because at the end of the day, we go to work and we should be building things that are sustainable by default. We should not be creating things, whether it's digital or physical, we should not be creating things that are not sustainable, because at the end of the day, this is, we have finite resources in the world. So if it's not sustainable by default, we're doing something wrong. Now, when we talk about web, there's a really nice example that I love. It's by Climate Action Tech. That's a Slack community around the topic. Their branch magazine. So by default, they have created a page that you go on and it doesn't load images. And it's based on the fact that you have a high carbon intensity of the grid. So it means it can identify if, for example, you're in Ireland with a dirtier grid, you would probably get the yellow version, and if you were in, say, Sweden, which is a greener grid, you would get the greener version. Nice idea? Not quite. The default is that you are on high. So then at the end of the day, I as a user get to choose, actually, I want to load the images. Now, indirectly, you might think, yes, but then you're making the responsibility on the user. No, you're reducing that decision-making. You're giving them the default is sustainable. And if you consciously decide to have the less sustainable version, you have consciously decided that. By not giving sustainable by default, you're giving so many options, too many options for the user, and they will just mainly, very often, will just stay on what's been given to them, right? So the first step, obviously, to all of this and any of this is to agree that this is important, and that we all have a part to play, not just developers, not just marketing, not just business, not just designers, not just UX. All of us. We all have a part to play in a different way, but we all have a part to play. Because being sustainable should not be a nice to have, because at the end of the day, a habitable planet isn't just a nice to have. And so I urge you to practice sustainable habits, not just at home, not just in life, but figure out how you can take this to work with you every single day. Whether you're a developer, you can go and look at green coding. Whether you're a business person, you can look at how can you also design and define your business values around this. And you also want your entire tech stack and everything that you build in software also to be sustainable. And I know I started out with saying that targeting one industry, so for example, the restaurant that I started out with, they're targeting just one industry, which is obviously the meat industry, and they're neglecting another industry. But at the end of the day, this is the industry that we have the power to change. And I truly believe that we, as a collective, we can impact climate change one bite at a time. Now, if you're interested in this topic, and I really, really hope you are, because it's a really interesting and really important topic, I urge you to, again, take a photograph of this slide. These are really good places to start. Now, I would say the most important place to start is the Green Web Foundation. There's a lot of resources on there. The 2 top books, kind of like the grandfathers of sustainability in the web and tech, and there's more resources every day. I mean, I started out on this topic maybe a year and a half ago, and the difference between then and now is massive. There's a whole community talking about it. Climate Action Tech is the first place that you should go on Slack. And people are trying to make a difference, and there are so many discussions going on. And then another one is a sustainablewebdesign.org. They have a manifesto in there. There's also a lot of information on how you can actually calculate. There are tools that you can use, the CO2JS, so many things out there. It's kind of overwhelming with the amount of stuff once you realize how much there is. But I urge you to educate yourself, because this topic is not going away. It's only going to get bigger. The tech industry is a little behind when it comes to sustainability, but they're going to be coming for us soon, if not next year or the year after, but definitely fairly soon. OK, so I want to ask you how your websites did. You don't want to tell me? Oh, do you want to, shall I throw you a, I don't know if that's on. Is it on? The top black thing, you speak into it, it's a microphone.
OK, well, pretty bad, actually. I think better than 80% of the sites.
OK.
So it's a low-traffic site, so that's just eating up space, I guess.
Yeah. Is it necessary to exist?
Good question.
Good question. OK. Anybody else? Here we go at the front.
We just got a new website like Monday, and it was already, the old one was indexed. So I saw both results. And the first one was really red. And now we get better than 58 of the web pages. So
OK, so it's not terrible.
No, but it's better. It changed
better.
Over like this week, so that's cool.
OK, so it's improved. And green hosting, I would make the assumption.
I don't know.
If you scroll down on the page, it tells you, so you get the percentage, and then if you scroll down, you also get the whether it's being green hosted, which, by the way,
it appears to be running on sustainable energy.
OK, great. So it does tell you that. I mean, this is a very simple tool. It's kind of based off the Green Web Foundation as well. They kind of use the same calculators. Anybody else want to share their results? Yeah, at the back here.
We've got 0.13 grams.
OK.
So we're 88%. But I do have to talk to the CEO, because we are not on green hosting.
Yes. Thank you, and that is my point. It's, I was talking about green hosting. It's the low-hanging fruit. It's the first thing that you can do, and it's the easiest thing, because at the end of the day, you're just signing a piece of paper and sending it over to some other provider, right? Like, you don't have to do anything about it. So green hosting absolutely is the lowest hanging fruit. But from there, start optimizing your content. So if this is a topic that interests you, and you want to talk more about it, and believe me, I have a hell of a lot more to say than this. This is very high level. I can go deeper, and I want to go deeper. Please find me on LinkedIn. If you want to talk technical, I can definitely point you in the right direction of people. There's a whole community out there that I'm talking to. I am talking to the authors of these books that I showed you. So do reach out to me on LinkedIn and start that conversation. Thank you.